It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that made everything feel heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. Inside a small, modest house, a little girl sat quietly by the window, her small hands pressed against the cold glass. She stared out at the gloomy sky, lost in her thoughts. Her mother moved around the house, but the weight of the silence seemed to hang in the air between them. It had been over a year since her father had passed away, and though the time had gone by quickly, it hadn't made the pain any easier to bear. The little girl missed him terribly, more than words could express, and the ache of his absence never seemed to leave her heart. She had tried, as children do, to understand the reasons why he was no longer there. Sometimes she would sit alone in her room, holding his old jacket and wondering why the world had to be so cruel. But today, something felt different. Something stirred within her, a deep, quiet yearning to be near him, to feel closer to the father she had lost. "Mom," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was small, but filled with an intensity that made her mother pause. Her mother turned around, a weary smile on her face, unsure of what her daughter might say next. "I want to go see Dad," the little girl continued. For a moment, her mother stood frozen. Her heart ached at the words. She had always tried to protect her daughter from the harsh realities of grief, trying to shield her from the pain of loss. But deep down, she knew this moment would come. Her little girl, who had been so brave through it all, was now asking to go to the grave of her father. The mother's breath caught in her throat. She had not been to the grave herself in months, afraid to confront the overwhelming sorrow that the place seemed to hold. But she could see the look in her daughter's eyes, a mixture of determination and sorrow, a quiet plea for connection to the man they had both loved and lost. Without saying much, her mother grabbed her coat, and together, they left the house. The world outside was still damp from the rain, and the streets were slick with water as they made their way to the cemetery. The little girl's hand tightened around her mother's fingers, and although they said little on the drive, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken emotions. When they arrived at the cemetery, the little girl's eyes darted around, searching for the familiar gravestone. She had been here before, but today felt different. Her heart beat faster with each step, and her small shoes made soft thuds on the wet ground. The cemetery, usually a quiet place of reflection, felt eerily still. There was a sense of heaviness in the air, like something was waiting. As they reached the row of gravestones, the little girl stopped. "There," she whispered, pointing to the stone that marked her father's resting place. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was a sense of purpose behind it. Her mother followed her gaze, her chest tightening as she saw the name etched on the stone. It had been so long since she visited. But just as they began to approach the grave, something strange happened. The wind picked up, swirling around them as if it had a mind of its own. The trees seemed to whisper in the distance, their branches swaying unnaturally. The little girl stood motionless, her eyes locked on the grave, but there was something different in her gaze. She seemed almost entranced. "Mom, I think he's here," the little girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's heart skipped a beat. She looked at her daughter, unsure of what she meant. Was this the grief talking, the imagination of a child, or was there something more to it? The air felt thicker now, the silence overwhelming, as if time itself had slowed down. Suddenly, the little girl began to walk forward, her small feet moving quickly toward the grave. Her mother tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. Something in the way her daughter moved, with a sense of urgency and purpose, left her with a strange, uneasy feeling. "Wait, be careful, sweetie," her mother called, but it was as if the little girl didn't hear her. She reached the grave and knelt down, her hands resting gently on the cold stone. The mother approached cautiously, her heart racing as she saw her daughter in such a deep state of focus. What was going on? Why did it feel like something was shifting, like the world around them was changing? As she reached her daughter's side, the little girl spoke again, but this time her voice was different. It was softer, almost as if she were speaking in a trance. "Daddy, are you here?" she asked, her words almost lost in the wind. The mother stood frozen, a chill creeping down her spine. Something was happening, something that didn't make sense, something that felt far beyond anything she could explain. Just as she was about to pull her daughter away, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble slightly. The wind howled louder, and for a brief moment, the sky darkened even more, casting an eerie shadow over the cemetery. The little girl looked up suddenly, her wide eyes filled with wonder and fear. "Mom, I saw him. I saw Dad." Before her mother could say anything, the air seemed to shift again, and a distant sound, a voice, seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the earth. The voice wasn't clear, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice the mother knew all too well. And in that moment, everything stopped. The world held its breath once more, leaving only one haunting question hanging in the air. What was happening at the grave of her father? And was it truly him that the little girl had seen? The wind howled again, as if protesting against the stillness that had descended on the cemetery. The little girl remained kneeling at the grave, her eyes fixed on the stone, her face pale but full of something else, something her mother couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, nor was it sadness. It was as if she were looking into a world only she could see, a world that her mother couldn't understand. The voice, though faint, still echoed in the back of her mind. It was unmistakably familiar. The mother's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She had always been a skeptic when it came to things she couldn't explain. It had been a part of her nature to push away things that didn't fit into her neatly structured world. But now, in this strange moment, with the cold air pressing in on them and the dark clouds swirling above, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Sweetheart, it's time to go. Come on, let's leave." Her voice trembled as she reached down to pull her daughter gently by the arm. But the little girl didn't move. Instead, she looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "Mom, I heard him. I heard Dad." Her voice was soft but firm, as though she were trying to convince her mother of something only she could know. The mother hesitated. She felt a chill spread through her bones. How could this be? She had never told her daughter about the strange feeling she had when she visited the grave before. She had never shared the deep, gnawing pain that had made her keep her distance from this place. But now, standing beside her daughter, she felt it, something pulling them both in, like a force they couldn't fight. "Sweetie, listen to me." Her voice quivered as she tried to reason with her. "Your father, he's gone. We can't bring him back. I know you miss him, and I do too, but we have to move on." The little girl's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She shook her head slowly, her voice barely audible. "No, Mom, he's here. I can feel him. He wants me to stay." A heavy silence followed her words. The mother's heart sank as the words lingered in the air, settling over them like a dark cloud. How could she explain to her daughter that what she was feeling wasn't real? That grief had a way of twisting our perceptions, especially for children who hadn't learned to separate fantasy from reality. But deep down, something told her that her daughter wasn't simply imagining things. There was something far deeper going on. It wasn't long ago that they had both buried him, her husband, her daughter's father. They had been a happy family once, their home filled with laughter and warmth. But a sudden illness had taken him from them far too soon. It had been quick, cruel, and devastating. The mother had watched him slip away from them, helpless to do anything about it. And in the aftermath, she had buried herself in work, in distractions, doing everything she could to keep the grief at bay. She had thought she was protecting her daughter by not speaking of him, by avoiding the places that brought back too many memories. But now, as she looked down at her daughter, who was still gazing at the grave with such intensity, she realized that her little girl had been carrying a much heavier burden than she ever known. This wasn't just about missing her father. No, this was something deeper. It was a bond, something that connected them in a way the mother couldn't understand. And the more she watched her daughter, the more she was convinced that something was drawing her in, something beyond her comprehension. The voice, still faint but growing clearer, seemed to echo once more. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a call, a beckoning. The mother's blood ran cold. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't the wind. She heard it too. A voice she thought she would never hear again, calling out to them from the earth beneath their feet. "Mom," the little girl whispered again, her voice trembling with urgency. He's waiting for me. The mother's knees nearly buckled beneath her as the words sank in. Was this some kind of sign? Or had she lost her mind in her grief? She couldn't tell. She had heard stories of people who claimed to have felt the presence of loved ones after death. Ghosts, spirits, whatever they called them. But she had always dismissed it as superstition, as something that belonged in the realm of fiction. Yet now, in this very moment, with the strange atmosphere pressing in around them, she couldn't deny the unsettling feeling that something was happening, something beyond her ability to explain. The little girl's small hand reached out and gently touched the gravestone. She closed her eyes as if in a trance, her fingers trembling against the cold stone. The wind picked up again, swirling around them like a storm was coming, though there was no rain in sight. Her mother could barely breathe, the air thick and heavy with tension. Suddenly, the little girl gasped and pulled her hand back, her eyes wide in shock. "Mom," he said, "he needs me." Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with both wonder and fear. "He's asking me to come with him." Panic flooded the mother's chest. She felt like the world was slipping away beneath her feet. What was going on? She grabbed her daughter's arm, her grip tight, but the little girl seemed to resist her touch, her small body stiffening with a strange energy. "No, Mom. I have to go. I have to go with him. Please, let me stay." Her mother's heart raced, and for a moment, she could only stand there, helpless, as the gravity of the situation crashed down on her. She didn't know if this was some kind of emotional breakdown or if there was truly something otherworldly happening before her eyes. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let her daughter go. Not like this. With all of her strength, the mother pulled her daughter away from the grave, but the little girl fought against her, her tiny body racked with emotion. The wind howled louder now, almost deafening, as if the earth itself was trying to tear them apart. The voice, his voice, echoed in the distance again, but this time it was sharper, more insistent, like a command. "Mom, let me go," the little girl cried, her voice breaking through the chaos. And in that moment, the mother realized that she was no longer just fighting for her daughter's safety. She was fighting against something that neither of them fully understood, something that felt as if it was tearing them both apart. Was this truly her husband calling from the grave? Or was something far darker at play? The wind howled around them, louder now, almost deafening. The little girl's body trembled as if gripped by an unseen force. Her hands pressed tightly against the gravestone, as though she was trying to hold onto something that was slipping away. Her mother pulled harder, her own heart racing with fear, but the small girl seemed to resist with a strength that wasn't her own. "Let me go." The words were desperate now, raw with emotion. But the mother refused to let go. She was shaking, unsure whether her daughter was lost in her grief or if something truly otherworldly was pulling her in. She fought to stay composed, to hold onto what little control she had left. But the more she tried to pull her daughter away, the stronger the pull became, like some invisible force was drawing them both closer to the grave. "Please, don't leave me," the mother whispered, the words breaking her apart. And then, in the midst of the chaos, it happened. The air around them seemed to still, like the world had paused in a breathless moment of waiting. The ground beneath them trembled once more. But this time, it was different, more intense, almost as if the earth itself was trying to communicate. The little girl let out a sharp gasp, her eyes wide, her small body stiffening in shock. Suddenly, she turned to her mother, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom, he said he never wanted to leave us. He's sorry. He didn't want to go. He couldn't say goodbye." The mother froze, her grip loosening on her daughter's arm. The words hit her like a wave. Her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had buried so many months ago, was speaking to them, not from some distant realm, but somehow, through their daughter. The realization slammed into her chest, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to believe. The little girl's voice trembled. "He said he's always been with us, watching over us." Tears filled the mother's eyes as she pulled her daughter into a tight hug, not caring about the wind or the strange force still pressing in around them. She didn't need to understand it. She didn't need answers. She needed her daughter. She needed to hold onto the only piece of her husband she had left. "Thank you," the mother whispered through her tears. Thank you for letting me hear him again. The little girl pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes, and smiled sadly, but with a peace the mother hadn't seen in months. He told me to tell you, it's okay to move on. He's at peace now, and so should we be. For a long moment, they stood there, the grave silent and still before them. The wind had died down, and the stormy clouds seemed to break apart, letting a sliver of sunlight peek through the sky. It was as if nature itself had given them permission to heal. The mother kissed her daughter's forehead, holding her close. I love you, sweetheart. I love you both. With a final glance at the gravestone, they turned and walked away, leaving the cemetery behind them. The world was still and quiet now, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air, a bittersweet reminder of all they had lost, and all they had yet to gain. As they left the gates, the mother couldn't help but glance back one last time. The air felt lighter, the world somehow different. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully understand what had happened, or if the strange encounter was real, but one thing was certain: she and her daughter had been given a gift, a chance to heal, a chance to let go of the grief and hold onto the love that would always remain, no matter how far apart they were. And with that, they walked into the future, together, their hearts a little lighter, their bond a little stronger, knowing that love, true love, never truly fades, it only changes form.